moving on, let's talk about spousal support. So before we get on too much further, can you just give a definition of what's meant by spousal support?
Right now, what I'm doing is I'm just looking at materials that are published by the Department of Justice Canada, and they actually have a very, very good website, like a fact sheet on spousal support.
Mhm.
And basically, spousal support is the money that one spouse may have to pay to the other spouse for their financial support following a separation or divorce.
Okay.
In the States, it's quite often referred to as alimony. You might also hear
Aha.
it called maintenance. And spousal support is usually paid on a monthly basis, but it can be paid as a lump sum. So when we're talking about spousal support under on the federal website, they're talking about people that are married.
Mhm.
But spousal support and property are treated completely different under legislation because, as I'd said, the rules are different if you're in a common law situation than you are if you are married when you're dealing with property. When you're talking about spousal support, your rights to spousal support are exactly the same, whether you are married or in a common law relationship, if you meet the requirements that are set out under the Family Law Act to fall under the definition of spouse if you are not actually married. Like once you're married, you're automatically a spouse. But for the purposes of spousal support, if you're common law, you are not married, but you have to have cohabited continuously for a period of 3 years or more, or be in a relationship of some permanence, i.e., but not necessarily for 3 years, but you have a natural or an adopted child together. So if you've been in a common law relationship for 3 years or more, or if there's a child born in the relationship, you fall into the category of people who are entitled to claim or pay spousal support.
That is so interesting because just now we were talking about property division. And so for property division, it's the spouse has to be like the legally married spouse. Whereas here for spousal support, spouse could be either cohabiting spouse or legally married spouse. So the
Yeah,
term spouse actually changes even within family law. Is
it
that right?
does. And yeah, and that's what's really interesting. And I think you and I had talked about this earlier,
Mhm.
is that actually right in the Family Law Act, on the part that deals with property, there is a definition of spouse. And
Right.
it limits the definition of spouse to couples, people that are married to
Yeah.
one another.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with the part under the Family Law Act that deals with spousal support,
Yeah.
the definition of spouse is again set out, and it includes that provision that I just said, is that if you've been living together continuously for a period of 3 years or more, or in a relationship of some permanence, but there is a child born or adopted into the relationship, you fall into the definition of spouse for the purpose of the support. So that's how they make the difference between what applies when you're married and when you're common law, is how they're defining spouse.
Interesting. Okay, so now let's say that you're going to court and you're claiming for spousal support. Do the legal tests vary? Do the legal tests vary depending on whether you're legally married versus common law?
Um, the wording is a little bit different between the Divorce Act, which is what you can use if you're applying for spousal support under the Divorce Act,
Okay.
or if you're applying for support under the Family Law Act. And again, that's interesting. If you're married, you can apply for spousal support under either the Divorce Act or the Family Law Act. If you're in a common law relationship, you can only go under the Family Law Act because the Divorce Act doesn't
Right.
apply to you because you're not married. But the parameters and what the courts are going to look at and what you should be looking at if you're looking at avoiding court, but like entering into a separation agreement, is that there are a couple, like the number of things that they're looking at. So the purposes of spousal support is to compensate one of the spouses. And so again, this can be either married or common law, to compensate the spouse who sacrifices his or her ability to earn income during the marriage, or to compensate that spouse for the ongoing care of children, above and beyond any child support obligation, or to help a spouse who has financial needs that arises from the breakdown of the marriage. At the same time, spouses who are entitled to receive support also have an obligation to become self-supporting if and when
Mm.
it's reasonable. So in deciding how much support needs to be paid, generally the spousal support is requested by a spouse with a lower income. And the factors that are going to come into play on that is the financial means, needs, and circumstances of the parties, both of them, on the date of separation, the length of time they've cohabited, the roles that each spouse played in the marriage, the effect of those roles and the breakdown of the marriage on their current financial situation, ongoing responsibilities to care for children of one spouse as opposed to the other, and any previous orders or agreements that may have already been made about spousal support. So there's a number of different factors that the courts will look at when determining whether in fact spousal support should be paid or not. So
And
like
then,
there's really, it's a two-part thing that they need to look at. First of all, have you met the threshold test for saying your financial or your actual circumstances are such that you're entitled to support?
mhm,
And then once that decision is made, then the question is, all right, now we know that one of you is entitled to support. Now we have to figure out how much support is the amount of support that you should be getting or the other side should be paying.
but I'm just wondering, like, would a judge be more inclined to award a higher amount to a traditional traditional spouse as opposed to a common law spouse? I'm just wondering. I
It's the
mean,
only difference between the traditional situation
yeah,
and the common law situation is the fact that there's a marriage license in one case
yeah,
and not in the other. No,
okay,
judge cannot and will not discriminate on the basis. It's actually a human rights violation because it's discrimination on the basis of marital status, and you can't do that.
oh,
The other
okay,
interesting thing to keep in mind too is that I'm trying to be very, very careful about the pronouns that I use because we talk
right,
about he or she or husband or wife.
yeah,
The definition of spouse was also included to say that you can be a spouse if you're in a same-sex relationship.
right.
So you can have a pair of spouses that are both female or a pair of spouses that are both male. And the same rules are consistently applied. There is no difference for the rules that we're talking about for division of property if you are a homosexual couple or a heterosexual couple. Spousal support, it doesn't matter if you're in a homosexual relationship or a heterosexual relationship. Your rights are the same, and you don't have more or less rights depending on whether you're in a traditional male-female relationship or a unisexual relationship.
Okay, right. So last question now on the spousal support issue. Suppose I got divorced from my spouse and he's supposed to pay me spousal support. There's a court order, let's say, to pay me spousal support. Do I lose that entitlement if I move in with my boyfriend, a wealthy
Okay,
boyfriend? Let's say.
the general rule is that no. And again, like as we talked about before we actually started recording this,
Yeah,
many, many, many decades ago, the
yeah.
law used to be that if a married couple divorced, and it would be the husband would might be required to pay the wife spousal support, but she would lose that entitlement if she even slept with another person. Never mind moving in with somebody. She could lose her rights completely by not remaining chaste. The law has changed since then. So no, just because you move in with another person now does not disentitle you to your support obligation.
Right.
But again, depending on how your court order is worded, or if you have an agreement, like a separation agreement that governs that, there might be a provision that says if there's a material change in the circumstances of either party, that, that you can go back to court to have the entitlement and the amount of spousal support reviewed. And you might also have a list of things that include what, right off the bat, do the parties agree is a material change in circumstances that would lead to what's okay to be reviewed or not to be reviewed. And generally, the courts really frown upon one that says that, well, if you enter into another relationship with somebody else, then you lose your entitlement or the amount of the support that you're receiving should actually be reduced. That generally is not something that's going to fly very well. So again, my advice, and I haven't even said this yet today, but I'm going to start saying it now. Before you look at doing anything like that, talk to a lawyer first, because they'll be able to give you advice about how this information actually applies in your own fact situation.
Oh, so it's really fact specific. Like you can't really say in general.
Well, in general, you can say that just because you're sleeping with somebody else or moved in with somebody else, you're going to lose your spousal support. But it's always good to check because it really depends on what's in your court order and the agreement and what a lawyer may tell you. But the general rule would be it's not something in and of itself that will lead you to lose your spousal support.